As Coach Carroll looks to put together his coaching staff, could he turn to a very familiar name to be his offensive coordinator? And could that lead to a very familiar name to be his quarterback? That plus more on Wednesday's edition of the Locked On Raiders podcast for January 29, 2025.
You are Locked On Raiders, your daily Las Vegas Raiders podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Welcome in, Raider Nation, to another edition of the Locked On Raiders podcast. Thank you so much for making the show your first listen of the day. We definitely appreciate you, whether you're catching us wherever you find your favorite podcast or you're checking us out on the YouTube page. We definitely appreciate that. The show continues to grow each and every day. And, of course, Raider Nation, that's because of your support and the job that my man Ari's doing behind the scenes on the YouTube page, making us look good and sound good. We definitely appreciate him. We shout him out, and you can as well. He's on Twitter at Ari Produces. You can hit me up as well at your boy Q254. And more importantly, if you want to be a part of the show, 707-654-4693. That's the Locked On Raider podcast voicemail line. As a matter of fact, we'll have your calls and texts as we close out the show today in segment number 3, and plenty of feedback to get to, so we'll get to as many of those as possible. Segment number 2, we'll talk about a reunion of a potential quarterback with head coach Pete Carroll. And, of course, that potential quarterback would be one Russell Wilson, a guy that obviously Pete Carroll had a lot of success with in Seattle until he didn't. Until he decided it was time to move on from him, send him to Denver. Denver booted him out the club. He ended up in Pittsburgh and had some success for a while in 2024 until they didn't, until that final stretch of the season where they eventually lost all 5 games, 4 in a row to close out the regular season. And then the first playoff game, the wild card round, they lost to the Baltimore Ravens. So they closed things out on a 5-game losing streak. But there could be a Russell Wilson sighting in Las Vegas. I'll talk about that and tell you how I'd feel about that in segment number 2. Here in segment number 1, just news and notes of the day. And as we jump into it, it's going to be about coordinators and who could be potentially in line to be on Coach Carroll's coaching staff. We'll jump right into that after I tell you about the title sponsor of this show, which is PrizePicks. Go to prizepicks.com/LockedOnNFL. Use code all lowercase LockedOnNFL to win $50 instantly when you play $5. So let's go ahead and jump right into it. We've already talked about the guys defensively that the Raiders have looked into or potentially even interviewed at this stage of the game. Patrick Graham is the current Raiders defensive coordinator. Of course, his contract ran out. He interviewed with the Jaguars for their head coaching spot, but also interviewed with the Jaguars for their open defensive coordinator position, which I think is kind of weird, right? I mean, he didn't get the head coaching job. That went to Liam Cohen, a first-time head coach, and now Patrick Graham, who wanted that position, be the defensive coordinator. Again, that might be okay for him. He might like that. I think it's kind of weird, kind of funky. So he's not ruled out of the mix as far as the Raiders coaching staff. Defensive line coach Robbie Leonard, he's not ruled out of the mix. He interviewed with the Raiders on Monday. So that's a potential hire if the Raiders decide they want to go in that direction. I think Robbie Leonard would be really good if they do end up losing Patrick Graham. I think Robbie Leonard would be a really good option. He's got a lot of upside, and he really has helped that defensive line. Even when the big names went down, they still were able to provide and able to produce. That's the word I'm looking for, produce, and they did it at a high level. So Robbie Leonard would not be a bad one. And then they also requested to interview Seahawks defensive back coach Carl Scott. But let's turn our attention to the offensive coordinator. Who could be in line for that? And we've had a couple people hit us up on the Locked On Raider podcast voicemail line and give a couple names, and I wasn't too high on them. And of course, lo and behold, one of those names appeared on Tuesday. Saw this from Jeremy Fowler and Tom Pelissero of the NFL Network, and then Jeremy Fowler of ESPN. The Raiders interviewed Dolphins quarterback coach and passing game coordinator Darrell Bevell today for their offensive coordinator job. Bevell and Pete Carroll won a Super Bowl together in Seattle. Now a possible reunion in Las Vegas. So that name, Darrell Bevell, that's been a name that Raider Nation has floated out multiple times. I know that he had success with Pete Carroll in Seattle until he didn't, right? And so, I mean, he's been around the league for a very long time. And, we'll see what happens. It's not a name that pushes me as far as, oh, man, I think that'd be a really good OC. But, again, knowing the kind of offense that Pete Carroll and the kind of identity that Pete Carroll's going to want to have with this team, it's understandable when you think about familiarity, especially since in his opening press conference on Monday, he said he wants to put together a staff with people that are familiar with him, that he's worked with, guys that he hasn't worked with, and then also guys that are currently on the Raiders coaching staff. So obviously Darrell Bevell, he's got a long history with them, even had to fire him in 2018 or after 2018 when things weren't going well in Seattle. Vinny Bonsignore from the Las Vegas Review-Journal tweeted this out on Tuesday. Makes sense. Pete Carroll would give Darrell Bevell an interview. During their time together, the Seahawks offense was 18th. That was the year before Russell Wilson arrived. Then it was 3rd, 2nd, 4th, 6th, and 13 in scoring. Raiders ranked 23rd and 29th the last 2 years. Need to hit the ground running on offense. So there's that. You can see that there's a, there was obviously some success there, but then you remember how successful those Seattle Seahawks teams were, especially with their rushing attack led by Marshawn Lynch. And then, of course, when Russell Wilson arrived, as Vinny pointed out, he was able to do enough to make that offense go. Obviously, the Legion of Boom and their defense was really good, but they were good offensively. And that's when Darrell Bevell was cooking with grease. And in 2018, as I mentioned, he got fired by Pete Carroll. Since he's been out of Seattle, he's been in the OC in Detroit. Then he was the interim head coach in Detroit. He was the OC in Jacksonville. Then he was the interim head coach in Jacksonville. He's now the quarterback coach and passing game coordinator in Miami. So Coach Mike McDaniel there in Miami was like, you know what I'm not going to do? I'm not going to make this guy the OC, because if he turns into the OC, I get fired and he becomes the interim coach like he did in Detroit and in Jacksonville. But that's just a little bit of, backstory on Darrell Bevell. Again, it's not a name that's unfamiliar with Raider Nation or the NFL. It's been around for a very long time, but I found this to be pretty intriguing when it comes to the whole Darrell Bevell situation. And Ian Rappaport from NFL Network had this to say on why, if the Raiders did decide and Pete Carroll did decide to go with Darrell Bevell, why this could be a very significant hire for the Silver and Black.
To me, that's sort of the trickle-down effect of this news. Obviously, if the Raiders do end up hiring Darrell Bevell, you have a proven offensive coordinator. We know that he's done it. Certainly something, Ben Johnson's been a great play caller. Learn from Darrell Bevell. I mean, this is a guy who is really one of the sort of old-time gurus. But that's not why we're talking about this. Let's just be real. We're talking about this because of the potential, Mike, for Russell Wilson to land in Las Vegas. We know he and Pete Carroll have remained in contact. We know the Steelers would like to re-sign him back, but he wanted to be a Raider last year. The fact that his old offensive coordinator may land in Vegas as well kind of helps us put some of the pieces together.
So as much as he's talking about the success and the familiarity that, Pete Carroll has with Darrell Bevell and knows the kind of offense that he wants to run and the identity, all roads lead back to Russell Wilson as far as Ian Rappaport's concerned. Like, that's why they're talking about Darrell Bevell, and that's why he thinks that Darrell Bevell's being interviewed, because not only is he familiar with Pete Carroll and what he wants to do, Russell Wilson is as well, and he knows how to get the most out of Russell Wilson, especially if he's able to humble himself and not try to be Russell Wilson, Russ Cooks, instead just trying to do the guy what he did in Seattle when they were very successful. So we'll see. We'll talk about Russell Wilson in segment number 2, because that name is going to be a name that you're going to hear a lot of when it comes to the Raiders until he either re-signs in Pittsburgh or he signs elsewhere and he's no longer out there available, right? Because remember, he was on a 1-year deal in Pittsburgh, so he's going to be a free agent similar to Justin Fields. But we'll talk about him coming up in segment number 2. Now, there is a side note that I'd like to point out that we found out on Tuesday evening from Tom Pelissero and many others that cover the NFL nationally, that former Cowboys head coach Mike McCarthy is sitting out the 2025 coaching cycle. Remember, he's the last guy that basically was let go. Everyone thought he was returning to Dallas as the head coach, and then Jerry Jones and him weren't able to come to an agreement. They eventually went on with Brian Schottenheimer. He interviewed with the Saints. It looked like he was probably going to be in line to get that job. Well, now he's deciding he's going to sit this bad boy out, and he'll focus on the coaching cycle in 2026. I'll say this, all right? I'm not too high on the Darrell Bevell hire, but I'd probably be over the moon. I might do a backflip, and I'm not a gymnast. I might do a backflip, or at least attempt one. I might break an arm or something if Pete Carroll were to find a way to pull Mike McCarthy as the offensive coordinator. And I know Mike McCarthy is nothing sexy when it comes to being a head coach, except for in Dallas, he went 12-5, 12-5, 12-5, and then last year he had a down year dealing with all those injuries. But there's one thing he can do, right? He can coach an offense. Right? I'm not saying he's the best head coach. I think he has plenty of blunders that he makes as a head coach. But obviously he's a lot younger than Pete Carroll. I don't care about Pete Carroll's age. But if they were to bring in Mike McCarthy as the OC, I can even see him being really successful with the team as they put this thing together. He's a guy that loves the run game. Obviously, he needs to have a quarterback to make things go, but he really likes to hang his hat on the ability to run the rock. That's why him and Kellen Moore didn't really get along when he first arrived in Dallas, because Kellen Moore was throwing the ball all around the yard, and he wanted to run the ball. He wanted to really focus in on that. Obviously, last year, they didn't have a running back. Hell, the last 2 years, they haven't had a running back. Remember when they got rid of Zeke, and then they decided that their brilliant idea was to bring Zeke back? Yeah, you know what? I just got rid of that guy. I got an idea. Let's bring him back. Let's get back with our ex. Never a good idea. Never a good idea. You released him for a reason. He went and played a year for the Patriots, and then you decided, hey, he's older. He's got more wear and tear on his body. He's probably a little bit slower, probably a little bit more out of shape. Yeah, I think he'd be a good guy for the job. Bad idea. Terrible idea. But I'll tell you, and again, I don't know if there's any interest in Mike McCarthy as offensive coordinator, and I don't know if Mike McCarthy has any interest. He's shown in the past that he'll be very patient. He doesn't need to just jump right back into coaching right away just for the sake of it. He's not one of those guys that's itching to be a coach at all costs. But again, as I mentioned a long time ago, Don Yee is his agent. Don Yee also is the agent of one Tom Brady. So I would not be surprised if at the very least there may be a phone call to Mike to say, hey, at least get on the phone with Pete. If in fact Pete is open to having Mike McCarthy on the staff, I would think that would be a home run if they could find a way to pull it off. But again, that's just me talking. That's me, just kind of scatter shooting right now. Just some thoughts like we're hanging around the water cooler. But we will talk about Russell Wilson because again, he's a guy that's definitely going to be tied in with the Raiders until he's not. So that'll come up in segment number 2 of today's Locked On Raiders podcast. Before we get to that, though, I do want to tell you about the title sponsor of this show, which is PrizePicks. And you know, the big game is almost here. There's no better way to make it even more exciting than with PrizePicks. It's the best place for daily fantasy sports. With over 10 million members and billions with a B in winnings awarded, PrizePicks makes it fun and simple to get in on the action. So here's how it works. You pick more or less on at least 2 players' projections. And if you're right, you can win up to 1,000 times your cash. PrizePicks even has a free pick for that big game where one of the starting quarterbacks only needs to throw 1 yard to win. Pair that with one more correct pick, and you're cashing out just like that. Well, what do you have to do to get in on the action? It's simple. Download the app today. Use the promo code LOCKEDONNFL. It's all one word to get $50 instantly after you play your first $5 lineup. That's promo code LOCKEDONNFL, LOCKEDON NFL. Someone actually told me the other day on Twitter that I reminded them of Method Man when I said that. Remember when Method Man back in the day said METHOD, man? So if anytime I could ever say anything that reminds anyone of Method Man, I'm winning. So again, the promo code LOCKEDONNFL, LOCKEDON NFL for $50 instantly after you play your first $5 lineup. PrizePicks, run your game. Should have never told me about Method Man. Just saying. All right, Raider Nation, here we go. Segment number 2 of today's Locked On Raiders podcast. Got to get into the conversation of the inevitable, which is Russell Wilson. There was a lot of folks last year when Russell Wilson was available, when Denver kicked him out of the club, when they basically paid him $90 million to go away, and everyone knew that his contract would be about $1 million. A lot of people called into the podcast and said, Q, need to go get Russell Wilson. Need to go get Russell Wilson. He'd be a really good quarterback. And I said, no thanks. I think he's done. If a team pays a guy $90 million to go away, he probably doesn't have much left in the tank. Well, he gets in Pittsburgh. He gets hooked up with Mike Tomlin, who is a very good coach, by the way. And Mike Tomlin, I think, gets the most out of him. Has a really good season with him until he didn't at the end. And honestly, it's funny. I didn't know if Russell Wilson was ever going to get on the field. Remember, he signs on in Pittsburgh. Mike Tomlin says he's in pole position. He's going to be the starter. They traded for Justin Fields, so they have both guys on a 1-year deal. And then Russell Wilson gets hurt, gets that hamstring injury, can't start training camp. He just doesn't start the regular season. Justin Fields is the guy, plays 4 games, and then they make the decision to switch things up and go to Russell Wilson. Again, I questioned Mike Tomlin and thought, bad decision. It turned out to be a really good decision. Russell Wilson did some really good things. And then down the stretch of the season, when they played 3 tough games in 11 days, they went from Philadelphia to Baltimore, then Kansas City in 11 days, with Kansas City being on Christmas. Just miserable 11-game stretch. Then they closed out with Cincinnati, the Bengals, who were very desperate to close out the regular season. Then their first game in the wild cards was against the Baltimore Ravens, and they lost that. So they ended on a 5-game losing streak. George Pickens was very hot and cold as far as a wide receiver. He's very temperamental. He's one of those dudes. I mean, you want to talk about a diva wide receiver. He's a different dude than that. Right, he's just one of those, you never know what you're going to get with him. So it's kind of like you pick your poison. He didn't have a whole lot going on. The running game with Najee Harris and others wasn't as good as it should be. Warner is a really good running back. He can hit the home run, but it wasn't really cooking as well as it should. And then, of course, the defense is strong. But they just weren't able to get it done. I think that they needed a lot more as far as weapons and help for Russell Wilson. He wasn't able to get it done. Again, I'm not a big Russell Wilson fan at this stage of the game. I was a big fan of him when he was coming out of college. I thought that he was an absolute winner when the Seattle Seahawks picked him in the third round. I thought he was going to be the best quarterback coming out of that draft. I pretty much was right. He was that guy. There's a reason why the Texas Rangers selected him in the draft, because he was just an absolute winner. So there were some things to like about him. Again, things changed. He evolved. He obviously wanted to have a bigger role in the offense, as opposed to just basically, I don't want to say a game manager, but a guy that did just enough to help them win, come up with some big plays, and use his legs as well. He wanted to have a much bigger role, and once that happened, he really kind of started to fall off. So with that being said, there's a lot of conversations about where is he going to play in 2025. It sounds like the Pittsburgh Steelers are going to do everything they can to bring him back. As a matter of fact, Adam Schefter from ESPN was on the morning show on Sportsmanlike on Tuesday morning and had this to say about Russell Wilson as it pertains to the Raiders. And you hear him bring up the Steelers, and it sounds like the Steelers are priority number one for them to bring in Russell Wilson. But here's Adam Schefter talking about the Raiders, and would Russell Wilson be a fit?
Look, here's the deal. At one point in time, they traded away Russell, and there was a lot of talk that would happen. I think both men, Pete and Russell, are smart enough to recognize that they made each other better and that they were good with each other. Is it an option? I guess it would be. I guess. I don't look at it as some marriage waiting to happen this offseason, but they're a team that needs a quarterback. He's a quarterback that's going to need a home. It's going to start in Pittsburgh. If it doesn't work out, sure, I guess Vegas might be an option. I'm not all that this is a marriage waiting to happen. But look, again, they're both in a spot where if he doesn't re-sign with Pittsburgh, he's going to need a home, and there aren't that many of them that makes sense like that.
So again, I probably described it in a bad way, but Adam Schefter is saying that the Steelers are going to go after Russell Wilson, trying to bring him back, and that's the most likely spot that he'll be. But if things don't shake out, maybe because of the familiarity, he can end up with Pete Carroll and the Raiders. Now, of course, with Darrell Bevell, things might get heated up a little bit more, and all roads could point to Las Vegas for Russell Wilson. And this is the thing. I don't have a problem with him being a bridge guy. But that's the key right there. It's got to be a bridge type situation. And what I mean by that is he can't sign some big free agent deal like Kirk Cousins signed with Atlanta last year, only to see the Falcons go and get Michael Penix at number 8 overall in the draft, right? I don't want the Raiders to sign him to the idea that, okay, he's going to be the franchise quarterback. He's going to be the guy that's going to lead the franchise for the next 4 or 5 years. No, you have to understand and humble yourself to say, look, at this stage of my career, this is who I am. I'm not a guy that's going to be able to last for 4 or 5 years. I'm a guy that may make it 1 year, and then they make way for a young dude, especially if the Raiders are able to navigate through the draft and get their quarterback. We know that the quarterback draft is not real thick. It's not a real sexy draft class when it comes to the quarterback position. We all know that. But just say they find a way to get a guy that they feel very comfortable with. Then Tom Brady has mentioned it many times. He doesn't want a rookie to start. So I would be okay with Russell Wilson starting. I would be okay with Russell Wilson being a bridge guy. But at the same time, Russell Wilson has to have that understanding that that's who he is. They have to sit him down, and he's got to humble himself and understand that you are not that guy that at one point let Russ cook. No, he's not that guy, right? You have to go on there and do just enough, make smart decisions. Obviously the Raiders would build around him, as Pete Carroll mentioned in his press conference, as John Spytek mentioned in his press conference on Monday when I asked about the quarterback position. They could put some really good pieces around Russell Wilson. They already have really good pieces in Brock Bowers, Jacoby Myers, Big Mike. Right? I mean, they have some good pieces right there. They obviously need to get some running backs that are some dudes. They need to work on the offensive line, but they have something to work with. They really do. And, of course, if he wants to stretch the field because he does like to throw the deep ball, they have Trey Tucker that can get deep. So there's some elements that I like that I think Russell Wilson would do really well. I wouldn't be opposed to him being the starting quarterback to start 2025. But at the same time, as I mentioned, it's got to be with the understanding. You cannot all of a sudden have that Kirk Cousins moment. And if they were to sign him to a deal that was anything close to the Kirk Cousins type contract, that would be a fail. And I don't think that they would do that. I think John Spytek is way smarter than that. I know Pete Carroll is way smarter than that. So I don't see them doing that. But Kirk Cousins was just blown away when he found out that they were drafting Michael Penix at number 8 overall after they just signed him to a free agent deal. I don't want them to go after Sam Darnold. I don't think he's that guy, and he's going to want a big-time contract and prove that he's, that get that commitment to him to be the guy for the next 4 or 5 years. They don't need that, right? Again, I think their best plan of attack is to find their guy in the draft, whether that's this year or next year. But you've got to – I think the best plan to build this team the right way is to go get your guy in the draft. And I still think that there's a path to Shedeur Sanders. I think there could be a path to Cam Ward. I also think there's some guys that could be drafted later that Pete Carroll might like. He might like a Dylan Gabriel from Oregon. He might like a Jackson Dart from Ole Miss, who's a really good quarterback. He might like a Jalen Milroe, probably more than I like Jalen Milroe, and I'm an Alabama fan. But there's some guys that could probably fit the mold of what Pete Carroll's looking for that you can get a little bit later on. But with that being said, they'll probably need a guy. And Aiden O'Connell might end up being that guy, or he might not, especially with Aiden O'Connell not being familiar with Darrell Bevell or whoever the OC ends up being, and more importantly, Pete Carroll. Again, it would be some familiarity that would make sense, especially since from everything that I'm understanding, they've, whatever situations that they have between the two of each other, they've cleared those up. They're all good now. As you heard Ian Rappaport earlier, that Russell Wilson wanted to be a Raider a year ago. That didn't happen. Again, a lot of people wanted Russell Wilson to be a Raider a year ago. I did not. I did not think he'd fit in the locker room with what Antonio Pierce and the rest of the Raiders were trying to put together. I still don't. If you remember, AP was very, as a matter of fact, about the people that he put in the locker room. He wanted them to fit a certain mold, and I don't think AP and Russell Wilson would have got along very well, which is good because now that AP's already gone, that could end up being bad for Russell Wilson. So if he does have an opportunity and he doesn't re-sign in Pittsburgh, as Adam Schefter thinks he will, then maybe that door is open for the Raiders. And again, I wouldn't have any problem with them, but you have to have a certain understanding of who this guy is. He's no longer the superstar quarterback, the guy who has never had an MVP vote but thought he was an MVP, right? That guy. He's not that franchise saving quarterback anymore, but he could still have some good run in him as far as a bridge guy. It can only be a bridge guy. And I know right now someone's thinking, Q's pounding the table for Russell Wilson. No, I'm not. I'm saying a bridge guy only. And if he's able to do that, if he's able to check his ego at the door and agree to that, then fine. That's cool. Especially if it's a decent deal for the Raiders. I mean, remember, he still got $90 million just about to go away from Denver. That was just a year ago. So he signs a vet minimum deal with Pittsburgh last year. He'll probably get a little bit more this year. I'd be fine with that. But when you look back at it, hindsight's 2020, Gardner Minshew ended up costing the Raiders $15 million guaranteed for the next 2 years, or 2024 and 2025. He got $15 million fully guaranteed. Russell Wilson got about $14 million less than that a year ago in Pittsburgh and had a lot more production than one Gardner Minshew. So there's that. So I would be good with him again, but it's got to be a bridge type deal. And you're going to hear a lot about Russell Wilson to the Raiders until he signs, seals, and delivers with the Steelers or any other team across the National Football League. So what's on your mind? 707-654-4693. Your calls and texts will close out the show. Segment number 3 is coming up next on today's edition of the Locked On Raiders podcast. Before we get to that, though, I do want to tell you about a message from our sponsor, Intuit TurboTax. Taxes was waiting and wondering and worrying if you were going to get any money back, and then waiting, wondering, and worrying some more. Now, Taxes is matching with a TurboTax expert who can do your taxes as soon as today. An expert who gives your taxes their undivided attention as they work on your return while you get real-time updates on their progress so you can focus on your day. An expert who will find you every deduction possible and file every form, every investment, everything with 100% accuracy. All so you can get the most money back guaranteed. No waiting, no wondering, no worries. Now, this is taxes. Get an expert now on TurboTax.com. Only available with TurboTax Live Full Service. Real-time updates only in iOS mobile app. See guarantee details at TurboTax.com/guarantees. Here we go, Raider Nation. Segment number 3 of today's Locked On Raiders podcast. Your calls and texts. You have that Locked On Raider podcast voicemail line, 707-654-4693. Let's start things off with a text from Raider Shaq. It says, Big Q, Raider Shaq chiming in. It's been a minute. Couple things I want to touch. For one, I have a question for you. With Coach Pete now in the building and all the DK connections and conversations, I'm curious who you feel is a better option for us, DK or T. Higgins. Keep in mind, DK will need new money as his deal ends in 2026. T is almost 3 years younger. Also, I know not everyone is super high on Russ, but I think adding him gives us some flexibility with the draft. If Cam and Shador are off the board at 6, why not draft a blue-chip defender, Will Johnson, Abdul Carter, Mason Graham, and take a quarterback like Dart at 39? I think Russ is the perfect bridge for a quarterback like Dart. Give Russ a 2-year deal to give the kid some time to develop and give Russ some cracks at a playoff run. Let me know what you think. Raider Shack from the BX. That's Raiders from Raider Shack right there on the text line. Thanks so much for that. And yeah, I mean, it's funny. You just spend a lot of time talking about Russell Wilson, so you kind of know how I feel, and I'm right on line with you. Bridge quarterback, sure. Long-time franchise quarterback, not a chance. As far as, the wide receivers go, I mean, you can look at DK Metcalf. You can look at T. Higgins. You can look at there's a bunch of wide receivers that you could look at. There really is. I'm trying to remember now, and I forgot his name. I don't know how I forgot his name, but Chris Godwin, the wide receiver that's from Tampa Bay that hurt himself in 2024. Obviously, John Spytek, the GM, has a much familiarity with him, so I can see that as well. I can see the Raiders going into the draft and getting a wide receiver. Maybe they don't need a guy who's already established. Again, Brock Bowers serves as wide receiver 1 right now, right? And again, I don't know how they want to put everything together, but to me, he serves as wide receiver 1. Jacoby Myers is really stinking good. I can see him still being really good wide receiver 2. Don't forget, you still have Big Mike, right? And I know Big Mike didn't do a lot in 2024, but Big Mike is still really good. Trey Tucker's there. So there's some pieces that are in place. So I don't know who you'd want to give more money to. I know Pete Carroll is very familiar with DK Metcalf. Nobody really has ties to T. Higgins. I think T. Higgins kind of gets banged up a lot, a little bit more for my liking, but really good wide receiver as well. So there's a bunch of different directions that this team could go for sure. But I'm with you when it comes to the quarterback. I can see Russell Wilson being that bridge guy. And you mentioned some of the guys later on, like a Jackson Dart or others that, that the Raiders could be interested in. But thanks so much for that text. I do appreciate you. Up next, got a call from Joe from KC. He's calling to talk about GM John Spytek. Head coach Pete Carroll brings up a couple players that he wants to speak about. Here he is, Joe from KC.
Yo, what up, Q? It's your boy Joe from KC. And sure, you already know what I'm going through with living here, man. But I'm going to go ahead and talk about something a little bit more positive and a little bit more optimistic about Spytek and Pete Carroll. So I'm thinking about 2 players. One player from the Buccaneers, his name is Yaya Diaby. And then I'm thinking about Michael Bennett, that was with the Seahawks and Pete Carroll back in the Legion of Boom days. And when I think about those 2 players, it makes me hope that between those 2, they could find ways to put the right guys around Tyree Wilson and bring out that type of player. If you guys go back and watch Yaya Diaby, I mean, I watched him last year and was like, damn, that's who I want in Tyree Wilson. And then obviously Michael Bennett was Michael Bennett. So that's what I'm hoping for. If you guys haven't watched those guys play, they're very similar, like stature-wise to him, and I think that could possibly be they could be the key that unlocks, this extremely talented player. So love to hear your thoughts on that.
Joe, thanks for the call. Appreciate you. And yeah, man, you got to have the right core of guys around each other to get the best out of everyone. To your point, that's where the competition will come in, right? They'll find the right mix and match of those players. They need to achieve the ultimate goal. And that's why in Pete's first year in Seattle, there was like 300 different combinations of the actual roster, right? They'd move a guy from being first string to third string to second string. There's so many guys off the practice squad, back to the practice squad, off the team, onto the team. Like there was so many transactions because they were trying to find the guys that all fit. It's like a big puzzle, and they were trying to see who all fit together. And so that's the thing. That's why when John Spytek says, if you love football and you want to compete, there's a spot for you. If you don't, that's okay, but there's not a spot for you here. Like that's what I want to hear. I want to see how this thing is put together, and I want to see the competition that takes place to put this thing together. That to me is going to be the fun part of this staff building this team moving forward. So Joe, thanks so much for that call. I do appreciate you. Up next, got a text from Silver and Black Canuck. Hey Q, wondering if your guys over at Locked On Browns, I assume it exists, have heard any noise about their team being open to trade out of the number 2 spot. Do they think that they'll stand pat or possibly be willing to move on from 2? Thanks for doing the podcast. As always, been listening since the Mac trade. Silver and Black Canuck. Thanks for the text. I appreciate you. And those were some dark days, weren't they? The Mac trade. Oh man, don't remind me about where I was. I don't want to relive that. If you want to get a good laugh, if you ever have an extra 30 minutes or so on your hands and you just want to get a good laugh, go on back to the days when John Gruden decided to trade Khalil Mack and I had to go and do an emergency podcast. And believe me, I think it was an emergency podcast. It was more for me than anybody else, just to get all my anger out of my system that day. But back to the actual text that you have. And I haven't talked to the host of Locked On Browns about a possible trade out of the number 2 spot, but I'm very tight with my guy Emmett Golden from ESPN Cleveland. They're the flagship station there in Cleveland of the Cleveland Browns, and he has a really good relationship with Andrew Berry, and he actually hit me up immediately after the draft order was set and said, hey, do you think the Raiders would be interested in trading up to number 2? Because I know Andrew Berry is always a guy that's interested and intrigued in trading back and getting some extra draft picks, and he thinks that they would definitely be open to that. And I know Andrew Berry would probably be be open to that as well, just given the history of what he's done over the time as the GM there in Cleveland. So to answer your question in a roundabout way, I believe that's a sweet spot. If the Raiders are trying to get up to the number 2 spot, I think that they can. They just got to give Andrew Berry a call there in Cleveland. They can make that work if they think that, one of their 2 guys is either Cam Ward or Shador, and they have their eye on one of them, or maybe they feel good about both because, again, you're at the number 2 spot, so you take a shot at the guy that you want being taken at number 1. But thanks so much for the text. Really good stuff. Definitely appreciate you. Got a call from Raul in Phoenix, formerly of Seattle. He's calling to tell a funny Pete Carroll story that he has. Here he is, Raul in Phoenix.
Hey, Q, it's Raul from Phoenix, formerly from Seattle. And I got a funny story about Pete Carroll that I don't even think Pete Carroll knows. But so as you know, I used to live in Seattle, and one night I'm driving home from work, and it's rainy, it's dark, as it usually is in Seattle. And as I'm driving, I see someone approaching on a bike. And again, it's windy, it's rainy, and this guy's coming on a bicycle, and the wind is really blowing, and this guy's bike is getting blown into the street, and then he's quickly veering back into the bike lane again. But he's kind of over and over, he's kind of veering into the street. So as I'm driving I had a truck at that time. As I'm driving my truck, I started to slow down, and guess who it is? It's none other than Pete Carroll. And he's wearing all his Seahawks stuff, so it's dark blue, but no helmet. So he's riding a bike in the rain and the wind, getting blown into the middle of the street, but no helmet. And as I pass him and I see that it's Pete Carroll, I'm just awestruck because I literally almost killed this guy because he's getting blown into the street. And at the very last second, he somehow makes it back into the bike lane, and I veer a little bit off, and I almost killed this guy. And it always struck me as strange as a guy who is surrounded by helmets every day when he goes to work chooses not to wear one when he's riding a bike in that kind of weather. So, I guess if he is successful for us, I think Raider Nation owes me a little gratitude for not killing the guy when it was certainly somewhat likely that could have happened. Anyway, that was a few years ago when I used to live in Seattle. Obviously happy for Carroll to be signing with us, and hope he does well. And just a little funny story I had from several years ago. One love.
Raul, thanks for the call. That is a funny story, and I'm glad it worked out really well for Pete and really good for you as well, right? Glad you didn't take him out, man. That's a really good thing, and hopefully that, if he does some really good things with the Raiders, maybe we'll have a chance to share that story. Maybe I'll tell him that story anyway if I get a chance to see him. Say, hey, man, I got a guy that called in and let me know that you were riding your bike without a helmet, and, it was a little rainy and slippery there in Seattle, and he almost took you out, but good thing you didn't. See if he even remembers that. He'll probably get a good laugh and look at me like I'm crazy, but he'll still be pretty funny. Maybe I'll encourage him to wear a helmet, especially around this area where nobody knows how to drive. Nobody knows how to drive. So really good stuff, Raul. Thanks for the call. I guess the good thing is it doesn't really rain here, right? We don't have to worry about that. We were supposed to get rain over the weekend, and we haven't had rain since like July. We were supposed to get this big, heavy rainstorm over the weekend. Nothing. We didn't get nothing. So there's that. So I guess that's one good thing for Pete Carroll. He doesn't have to worry about it raining when he's riding his bike. Got a couple more. How about a text from Raider Idaho Prep? Raider Idaho Prep Company, Joe. There you go. Idaho Prep Co. Joe. There we go. That's what we're calling this. Q, I see this new staff working out really well for someone like Aiden O'Connell. One, he and Tom Brady have had similar starts to their careers where they were doubted at every level. And look what Carroll did for Geno Smith's career. Turned him into a solid 4,000 yard season quarterback. Thanks for the vine. That's Raider Idaho Prep Co. Joe. Really good stuff, and that's a good point. That's a good point about Geno Smith, and Pete Carroll helped get Geno Smith to that point that you mentioned. I thought Geno Smith was basically going to be a backup his whole career, and he ended up getting him a nice little contract extension, right? And he obviously did a lot better than Daniel Jones when Daniel Jones got the opportunity to get that contract extension in New York. So there, yeah, and I do think Aiden O'Connell is going to like the staff, and this thing works out really well for them or him, only because everything's about competition. So if he can win that competition, where a lot of people say he didn't get a real fair shake with Antonio Pierce in this last year with the Raiders, maybe this could be his real fair shake, and we'll find out exactly who he is. So I do think Aiden O'Connell is going to like this staff because it's all about competition. Thanks so much for the text. I do appreciate you. We'll close out with a call from Chef Raider. He's calling to talk about folks saying to be patient because it'll take some time to get things going with the Raiders. Here he is, Chef Raider.
Q, Raider Nation, what's going on? It's your boy Chef Raider. Real quick, so just a couple comments, or one comment really, I guess, about people saying be patient, and this isn't, because it's not a rebuild, but, it's going to take some time for it to get it going, because, new coach and all, and it's like, the man said that he's ready to, he's trying to win, you know what I mean? It's like, he's got a 3-year deal and all that, but if I'm not mistaken, I think he said that he's trying to win now. Like, they're trying to compete now. I don't see too many holes on our roster. I mean, like, yeah, we need some depth. We need depth all over the place. I mean, there's no arguing that. And I'm not saying that I think that Aiden O'Connell's the dude, but I'm saying that why are we further away than a good off-season worth of replenishing, adding pieces? Maybe we get a bridge quarterback. I don't love the idea of Russell Wilson, but maybe we get a Russell Wilson type of bridge quarterback. And, it gives us something around 8-9 wins. I mean, is that completely unrealistic to think that, an off-season worth of solid acquisitions and a new coach and, lease on life, that this team couldn't have a 4 or 5 game turnaround? Like, is that completely unrealistic? I mean, I'm not saying Super Bowl or bust or playoffs or bust or anything like that, but definitely like something to hang your hat on as far as, signs of life that, in the following year or years to come that we're going to be competing consistently. I mean, that's what I heard when I was listening to the press conference yesterday. I mean, maybe I'm completely off base. I mean, obviously my opinion's my own, but I mean, maybe I'm completely off base in thinking that, it's unrealistic to think that it could be a 4 or 5 game type of turnaround with, again, signing some of our key players and a good, solid offseason and, free agency and draft, some key pieces at key places, that would be unrealistic to think. I don't know. Maybe I'm wrong. Let me know. I'll holla.
Thanks so much for the call. I appreciate you. And yeah, there's no doubt that Pete Carroll's trying to win. I mean, he let that be known. He wants to get this thing turned around pretty quickly. It's not something that he wants to, build up for 3 or 4 years. And look, he only has 3 years on his deal, and the 4th year is a team option. So yeah, he definitely needs to do that. The good thing with Pete Carroll, if you go back and look at his head coaching career, he's never had less than 6 wins. So when I say be patient, and I have been saying be patient, I'm talking about on the playoff run. I'm not talking about winning 7 or 8 games. That's not going to get you into the postseason. But I definitely see the Raiders winning 7 or 8 games easily, right? Just because, again, Pete Carroll's never had less than 6, and that was like his first 2 years as a head coach in the National Football League. So I definitely think that what he's going to be able to do is going to be worth, more wins than the Raiders got in 2024. I just don't know if it's going to get them to double-digit wins, right? We don't know what the schedule looks like. We don't know what the roster looks like. We don't know how other teams in the division have improved, right? We don't know any of that. I mean, it's late January, right? So we don't know any of that. So I can't say and go out on a limb and be like, man, they're going to be a playoff team. That's why I said be patient. I do think the team is going to get a lot better. I didn't think that Jim Harbaugh and the Chargers would be in the playoffs their first year together, and they got there. Sean Payton got the Broncos there in year 2. I see that as more of a trajectory for the Raiders, more like what Sean Payton did in Denver, getting them to the playoffs in year 2, kind of turning over the roster, weeding out who he wants, who he doesn't want in year 1, and then year 2, they really take off. That's how I kind of see it going. But, again, Jim Harbaugh proved that he can get there in year 1. But the thing is, he had his franchise quarterback. The Raiders at this stage of the game, in my opinion, do not. So that's what I'm talking about. So it's not be patient like the Raiders are going to stink and they're only going to win 3 or 4 games. So maybe our definitions of patience and why you need to be patient and what you're being patient for are a little bit different. That's about it. But, yeah, he definitely wants to win right away. You're not wrong. So thanks so much for that. I do appreciate it. That's going to do it for today's show. All the calls and texts. We still got a text from LA Raider Steve. We got a call from Big E in the 209. We'll get more of that on tomorrow's show. We'll also talk about the Raiders' identity. Pete Carroll sat down with JT the Brick and Eric Allen on Monday following his introductory press conference and was talking about winning football. There's a question that EA asked him, and I thought that the answer was fantastic. So we'll let you hear that. We'll talk about that. So we'll talk about the Raiders and their identity under Pete Carroll. We'll do that on tomorrow. And, of course, we'll have more news and notes as well. And maybe we'll find out something more about coordinators offensively and defensively. So until then, Raider Nation, take care of yourself, take care of your family, love on your family. Most importantly, as always, just win, baby.